My husband mocked me during our divorce, saying I was just his shadow. But then I spoke. The low buzz of conversation died the moment the judge entered the courtroom. The wooden door closed with a solid thud behind her, and the room stood still under her gaze. I was seated at the plaintiff's table, hands clenched tightly in my lap, heart pounding against my ribs. Across the aisle, Martin adjusted his perfectly tailored suit with a smirk that barely concealed his sense of triumph. His attorney, a seasoned man with a confident stride, leaned in to whisper something that made Martin chuckle under his breath. From the outside, this looked like a simple divorce hearing. But for me, this was a trial not just of a marriage, but of whether a decade of my life meant anything at all. As the judge called the proceedings to order, I couldn't help but notice the subtle glances exchanged between Martin and his lawyer. They had rehearsed this performance, and I was just the closing act, meant to be dismissed quietly. Martin's narrative had already taken shape over weeks of testimony, that he was the sole breadwinner, the brilliant strategist behind every business success, while I was merely the decorative wife who hosted dinner parties and managed grocery lists. My own attorney sat beside me, determined but clearly outmatched in experience. I felt naked under the scrutiny of the court, yet somewhere inside, a quiet defiance sparked. I wasn't here to win his approval anymore. I was here to speak the truth, whether anyone chose to hear it or not. Looking back, the early days of our marriage felt like walking into a warm dream. Martin and I were young then, filled with ambitions and plans. He worked long hours building his consultancy firm, while I managed everything else, our modest apartment, his schedule, even his meals down to the temperature of his coffee. At first, he would thank me with a kiss on the cheek or a handwritten note on the fridge. But as the business grew and the congratulations started coming in from peers, those tokens disappeared. He stopped noticing the fresh flowers I arranged weekly, the way I kept his suits pressed and rotated, or how the bills were always paid on time even when the budget was tight. The shift was gradual. What began as shared dreams slowly turned into a hierarchy of value, and mine kept falling lower on the scale. When he bought his first luxury car, I remember the salesman shaking his hand and then turning to me with a shallow, congratulatory smile as if I were some prized decoration. I smiled politely, saying nothing, as Martin took the keys with pride. Later that night, I sat in the bathtub alone, wondering when exactly I had become invisible. I knew then that love had quietly exited our marriage long ago, and what remained was a partnership built on image and convenience, one that demanded silence from me in exchange for stability. The gala was held at the Metropolitan Club downtown, and I had spent nearly 4 hours preparing. My dress was a deep navy silk that clung in just the right places, modest yet elegant. I had styled my hair into a soft updo and chosen earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. I wanted, foolishly, to be noticed, not by strangers, but by Martin. As we arrived, the room sparkled with chandeliers and conversation. Martin greeted his colleagues like royalty, exchanging laughter and handshakes while I stood at his side like a mannequin on display. When someone asked what I did, I opened my mouth to speak, but Martin answered for me with a half laugh. Oh, she keeps herself busy. Between yoga, Pinterest, and reorganizing closets, she's got her hands full. There was laughter. Not just polite chuckles, but genuine amusement. I froze in place, eyes fixed on the rim of my wine glass as heat rose to my cheeks. No mention of the months I had spent coordinating renovations at our home, the grueling meetings with contractors, or the countless spreadsheets tracking household expenses. Just a dismissive joke. That evening, as Martin basked in admiration for his latest real estate investment, I excused myself and sat alone in the powder room. I stared at my reflection, lips painted, eyes wide, and asked myself a question I never thought I would. What was I doing here, dressed like a queen in a kingdom where my voice meant nothing? Life inside our home looked perfect from the outside. The marble countertops gleamed, the kitchen was always in order, and our holiday cards were photo shoot quality. But underneath the polished surface, I carried the weight of 1,000 invisible tasks. I was the one on hold with the insurance company for hours. I fixed the dishwasher when it broke, coordinated charity events for his firm, and even reviewed contracts he was too tired to read. I handled delicate family matters with his mother when she fell ill, planned his father's retirement party, and sent personalized gifts to his clients' children. I became the ghost that made everything run smoothly, and yet when people looked at our life, they only saw him. What made it harder was that I had allowed it. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed in partnership. I thought that what I was doing mattered, that I was building something with him. But Martin's appreciation diminished with every year, his compliments replaced with critiques. The pasta was overcooked, the floors weren't polished enough, I had gained weight in photos. I swallowed it all, smiling at dinner parties, laughing at jokes I didn't find funny, and pretending not to notice when he spent weekends away on work trips. My heart became a quiet room where no one knocked anymore. And yet, I stayed. Not because I was weak, but because I hadn't yet found the strength to walk away from a life I had built with my own hands. It was supposed to be a celebration. 10 years of marriage, and Martin insisted on throwing a grand party at the estate, complete with a catering staff, a jazz quartet, and 50 hand-selected guests. I had suggested something simpler, something intimate. But Martin liked the optics. He said it was good for business. I spent weeks organizing the event, coordinating rentals, ensuring the guest list was flawless. I even had his favorite bourbon imported for the occasion. I wore a champagne-colored dress, soft waves in my hair, trying to embody the image he loved to present, the elegant wife who had it all under control. As the evening unfolded, glasses clinked and laughter filled the garden. When it came time for speeches, Martin took the microphone, thanked the guests, and then turned to me with a rehearsed grin. And of course, he said, let's not forget my beautiful wife, the backbone of this home. She makes sure the sheets are always clean and the pantry's never empty. She's got a real talent for online shopping. A wave of laughter erupted. I stood frozen, my smile stiff and unmoving as the sound stabbed into me. No mention of the sacrifices, the midnight paperwork, or the nights I stayed up editing his proposals. Just a punchline. A shadow of a person. I knew then that something inside me had broken quietly, but completely. After that anniversary party, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, still in my dress, staring at a single candle flickering on top of the cake no one touched. My mind replayed Martin's words over and over until the laughter echoed louder than it had that night. I reached for a pen and began writing, lists of tasks I had handled, decisions I had made, and sacrifices I had offered without ever being asked. It wasn't about anger. It was about proof. I needed to remind myself that what I had done wasn't meaningless, even if he refused to see it. By the end of the week, I had filled an entire notebook with everything from tax adjustments I suggested to the broken pipe I coordinated to fix while he was out of town. Each line was a small act of resistance against the erasure I had endured. No one ever paid me. No one praised me. But the value was there, and writing it down gave it weight. I began documenting everything, not for revenge, but for survival. If Martin had erased me from the narrative of our life, I would carve my way back into it through ink and memory. Martin's world was full of power players and polished smiles, and I had learned to navigate it like a well-trained hostess. At every gala or board dinner, I floated between conversations, offering just enough charm without stealing the spotlight. But over time, I realized how many people didn't even know my name. I was introduced as Martin's wife or simply not introduced at all. I had mastered small talk, remembered spouses' names, and sent handwritten notes after every event, but I was still a ghost among them. One evening, at a charity auction, I overheard a woman ask Martin if he had come alone. He chuckled and gestured toward me, saying, "Oh no, she's always somewhere nearby." It was said with such casual indifference that I smiled only because I didn't know what else to do. But deep down, I felt like a piece of furniture, well-placed, elegant, and ultimately replaceable. I stood in that room of strangers, nodding and laughing in rhythm, but all I could think about was how far I had drifted from myself. The next morning, I found myself staring at my reflection for far too long. My face looked the same, but something in my eyes had changed. I no longer saw just exhaustion or disappointment, I saw a question forming, quiet but persistent. What if this wasn't the end of the story? I went back to my journals, flipping through the lists and memories I had scribbled down, and began adding research. Financial terms, investment strategies, digital business models. It wasn't enough to remember my value, I had to rebuild it. I enrolled in a series of online courses under a pseudonym, starting with basic finance and digital marketing. The work was dense and unfamiliar, but for the first time in years, I felt awake. I studied at night while Martin slept, headphones in my ears and notebooks spread across the dining table he never used. It wasn't about escape yet. It was about possibility. My mind, once dulled by routine, began to sharpen again. I was still in the shadows, but I had found a lantern, and I planned to keep it lit. I didn't tell anyone. Not even my closest friend, who lived 2 states away and only knew pieces of my unhappiness. What I was building felt fragile, like a house of cards that could collapse if too many people breathed on it. So I built quietly. I registered a business account under my maiden name. I created a discreet LLC and launched a content management platform for women-owned small businesses. No one noticed. Martin assumed I was keeping busy, just like he always said. Every time he dismissed me with a wave or an absent-minded kiss on the forehead, it fueled me. I took on small clients, reinvested every cent I earned, and slowly scaled up. I wasn't making millions, but I was proving to myself that I wasn't a burden, I was a builder. And it felt intoxicating. In a home where my voice no longer carried weight, I had created a space where people paid me for my thoughts. It was the first time in years that I didn't feel invisible. By the time my business reached its first 5-figure month, Martin still had no idea. That irony tasted better than any wine served at his corporate galas. I continued to play the part, attending events, managing the house, coordinating his mother's appointments, but in the early mornings and late nights, I tracked invoices and scheduled strategy calls with clients across the country. My life had split into 2 realities, the one he saw, and the one I had reclaimed for myself. And yet, I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because I didn't want this journey to be about him. I wasn't building this life to prove him wrong, I was building it to prove myself right. My victories were private, sometimes celebrated only with a cup of tea and a quiet moment of pride. But they were mine. And they were real. The shadow he claimed I was? That shadow had become a shape of its own. And soon, it would no longer follow him. It would walk beside its own light. One morning, while preparing for another networking event Martin insisted we attend, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, wearing the perfect dress, hairstyle just right, makeup flawless. But something didn't fit. The woman looking back at me seemed both familiar and foreign. I had become so good at becoming what everyone else expected that I had almost forgotten how to be who I truly was. I stood there, mascara wand in hand, asking myself quietly, is this still me? That day, I wore the dress, smiled at the cameras, and complimented everyone in the room. But my mind wandered back to the woman I used to be, the one who once dreamed of publishing a book, who loved art history, and who laughed too loudly when no one was watching. Martin didn't see her. Maybe he never had. But I had started seeing her again, and I wasn't about to let her disappear this time. When I first met Ava, my divorce attorney, I didn't expect much. She looked barely 30, and Martin's lawyer had 30 years of courtroom swagger. But within 5 minutes of conversation, I realized something that changed everything. Ava believed me. She didn't talk down to me or rush me through our first meeting. Instead, she listened, really listened, as I walked her through the years of silence and service that Martin had labeled as doing nothing. As I handed her the first of many notebooks I had kept, her eyebrows lifted, not in skepticism, but in recognition. You've done more than most executives I've worked with, she said plainly. That sentence hit me like fresh air. I had spent so long doubting whether I had anything of value to fight for that I forgot how to fight. But Ava didn't. And in that moment, I realized I had an ally, not just legally, but emotionally. Someone finally saw me as more than a shadow. Over the following weeks, Ava and I dug into the numbers, joint accounts, asset transfers, equity stakes in Martin's companies. While he had always acted like I was too scattered to understand finances, he'd grown comfortable enough to leave digital footprints everywhere. I had access to accounts he forgot I was listed on, business ventures he opened using marital funds, and luxury purchases disguised as work expenses. Every discovery added a new piece to the puzzle, and every piece told a story. What he failed to realize was that I had been quietly involved in these transactions for years. I had helped set up the billing software for his first consultancy. I was the one who managed vendor disputes and even advised him to renegotiate a major lease, advice he took, then later claimed as his own foresight. Now, those details became my proof. This wasn't just a marriage that broke apart. This was a life I helped build, and now, I had the evidence to claim my part of it. One afternoon, while sorting through old emails and tax files, I stumbled upon login credentials for a high-interest joint savings account we had opened 6 years ago. Martin had moved most of our money into different portfolios, but I had quietly kept that account active, occasionally transferring small, untouched bonuses and rebates into it. I hadn't checked it in over a year, but when I logged in, the balance made my breath catch. It had grown to 6 figures through accumulated interest and disciplined deposits. I stared at the screen, stunned. Martin had no idea this account even existed anymore. In his arrogance, he had stopped monitoring the details. That was his mistake. I printed the statements and handed them to Ava the next day. "He claimed you brought nothing," she murmured, flipping through the pages. "Let's show him how wrong he was." For the first time in a long time, I felt something more than sorrow or fatigue. I felt ready. The courtroom gallery wasn't full of strangers. Many of the people attending the proceedings were acquaintances from Martin's circles, former clients, socialites, and a few self-important neighbors who seemed to thrive on drama. I could feel their eyes on me as I walked in each day, their whispers like a swarm of bees I couldn't swat away. To them, I was just the soon-to-be ex-wife of a powerful man, standing on trial for being just a wife. One afternoon, during a recess, I overheard a woman in a red blazer whisper to her friend, "She probably wants half just because she folded his socks." They both laughed, eyes glancing at me with a condescending smirk. I didn't flinch. Not anymore. Because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had stopped folding his socks a year ago and started folding spreadsheets that would expose his lies. Let them laugh. The silence that would follow would be deafening. A week before closing arguments, Ava handed me a sealed envelope. "He filed a supplemental statement this morning," she said, her tone unreadable. Inside were copies of Martin's latest declaration. I read each page slowly, my breath tightening with every sentence. He had listed his accomplishments in excruciating detail, building himself up as the sole architect of our financial life. Then, in one cruel line, he wrote, "She never contributed anything measurable. Her role was purely ornamental." Those words didn't feel like daggers. They felt like cement. Heavy, cold, and determined to sink me. Ava watched me closely as I set the papers down. "We could counter this with everything you've shown me," she said gently. But I shook my head. Not yet. I wasn't going to argue with his lie. I was going to dismantle it in front of everyone he had tried to impress. I would wait until the moment he least expected it, until the stage was his, and the lights were brightest. The courtroom was packed that day. Martin's lawyer delivered his final remarks with flair, painting a picture of a self-made man held back by a passive partner. He gestured toward Martin with admiration, calling him a visionary, a leader who had graciously offered comfort to a woman without ambition. The crowd chuckled in places. And when Martin leaned forward to clarify a point, he added, "She's a lovely woman, Your Honor. But let's be honest, her biggest contribution was redecorating our foyer. Laughter erupted, not roaring, but cruelly sufficient. Even the judge had to raise her gavel to silence the room. My pulse throbbed in my ears, but I didn't look down. I sat still, hands folded, face composed. I looked at Martin. He didn't meet my eyes. He leaned back with that same smirk I had seen the day of our wedding when the world still called him charming. But something had shifted. I didn't feel pain anymore. I felt calm, like someone about to flip the final page of a very long book. After the session, I waited by the elevators with Ava when Martin approached. "That was difficult," he said with a mock sigh. "But I'm glad it's almost over. You'll land on your feet. Maybe write a blog or something." I didn't respond, not at first. I let the silence hang between us like smoke. Then I turned to him and asked, "Do you even remember who secured your first office lease?" His smile wavered, just slightly. I continued, quietly but firmly. "Or who negotiated your supplier contracts the first year? Who booked those client retreats and built the pitch decks you still use today?" His smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, but I stepped onto the elevator without waiting. "Don't worry," I said as the doors closed. "I'll remind the court for you." That was the last time I ever spoke to him outside the courtroom. The next time we faced each other, it would be with everyone watching. When our final hearing resumed, Ava approached the bench with a thick binder labeled Marital Contributions, 2008 to 2022. The judge raised an eyebrow as Ava handed over a digital copy along with physical documents. Then, I stood. My voice didn't shake as I requested permission to speak. The judge nodded. I walked forward, binder in hand, and began to read dates, names, financial planning notes, photos of spreadsheets, event records, even Martin's own emails thanking me for handling it all. The courtroom, once lively, became still. I recited line after line, proof that the invisible labor Martin dismissed had been foundational to every one of his successes. I spoke clearly, never raising my voice, letting the weight of each fact settle where it needed to. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I simply stated the truth, and as I turned each page, I saw the mask begin to slip from Martin's face. He shifted in his seat. His lawyer looked down. And the judge leaned forward. The judge didn't speak for several seconds after I finished. She removed her glasses, folded her hands, and stared directly at Martin. "Mr. Connors," she said slowly, "I find your characterization of your former spouse not only inaccurate but profoundly disrespectful." Her voice carried the weight of authority, but also something more, indignation. "You labeled her useless, yet the evidence here proves she held more roles in your marriage than most corporate executives do in a firm." Martin tried to interject, but the judge raised a hand. "No further comments. You had your chance to speak." Then she turned to me. "Thank you," she said. "This court acknowledges your contributions, and they will be reflected in my final ruling." In that moment, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt released. Like a weight I had carried for years had finally been set down. And in the silence that followed, I understood I was no longer anyone's shadow. As I stepped down from the witness stand, a soft murmur filled the room, not noise, but something almost reverent. My heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing louder than the laughter had hours earlier. I didn't return to my seat immediately. I stood at the plaintiff's table for a moment, facing forward, eyes on no one in particular. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't demanded pity. But in that courtroom, I had been louder than I had ever been before. Ava placed a steady hand on my arm as I Saturday. "You didn't just win the room," she whispered, "you reclaimed it." I didn't know what to say in return. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was steady, like it had finally found its rhythm again. Martin sat rigid across from me, his face no longer smug. I could tell he was trying to process what had just happened. For the first time in years, he was no longer writing the narrative alone. The judge adjourned for deliberation, but the silence in the room lingered. One by one, spectators began to rise and file out, subdued and pensive. No one looked at me the same way. The woman in the red blazer who had mocked me earlier now avoided eye contact. Martin's lawyer quickly gathered his papers without a word. Even the court clerk gave me a small, respectful nod. There was no applause, no dramatic fanfare. But the absence of laughter? That was victory. Ava and I left the courtroom together, walking side by side through the hallway lined with people pretending not to stare. It felt like shedding a skin I had worn too long, tight, constricting, and never truly mine. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. But inside me, something had shifted. The silence I carried for so many years had turned into something else entirely, strength. And it had spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. Later that evening, I received an unexpected call from Martin. I let it ring until voicemail picked up. I wasn't ready to hear whatever excuses or apologies he might attempt. But curiosity got the better of me, and I played the message. His voice was different. Not smug, not angry, uncertain. I didn't realize, he began, then paused. If I could go back, maybe I'd, never mind. I just wanted to say I didn't think you'd, never mind. That was all. No direct apology, no admission of guilt. Just fragments of a man who had finally glimpsed what he had tried to ignore for so long. I deleted the message without saving it. Not out of spite, but because I didn't need it. I had already said what I needed to say, on the record, in front of witnesses. There was nothing more Martin could offer me now that I hadn't already taken back on my own terms. Weeks passed before the final judgment was delivered. Ava called me with the results, a favorable ruling on asset division, a recognition of non-monetary contributions, and a significant financial settlement, including part ownership in one of Martin's firms. I sat at my kitchen table, holding the phone to my ear, trying to absorb what this meant. I wasn't just walking away with money. I was walking away with documented proof that my work, unpaid, unseen, had value. But that wasn't the real victory. In the privacy of my home office, I reviewed the growth of my own business. The platform I had built from scratch was now attracting high-value clients. My name, my real name, was beginning to circulate in circles that had once ignored me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was reacting to someone else's life. I was finally building mine. And it was real. It was strong. It was mine alone. It was through a mutual acquaintance that I heard Martin had been venting about the outcome of the trial. He told someone at a cocktail party, "She made me look like a fool. She was always difficult. I should have known she tried to drag me down. She turned into a liability." The words reached me 2 days later. I laughed, not out of bitterness, but because it confirmed everything I had once feared was true. That to him, I had never been a partner. I was a prop. A risk. An image. But this time, his insult didn't sting. It revealed more about him than it ever could about me. I wasn't a liability. I had been his foundation. And when I removed myself, the structure he stood on began to crack. He was right in one way. I wasn't part of his story anymore. But I wasn't dragging him down. I was rising without him. And there was nothing left for him to hold on to. The official ruling came in a manila envelope delivered by courier. I didn't rush to open it. I let it sit on the counter while I made tea, watching the steam rise from the mug as if waiting for a sign. When I finally opened it, I read the words slowly, carefully. The court recognized the full extent of my contributions, emotional, logistical, financial. The property division leaned in my favor. Martin's businesses were to disclose dividends going forward. Justice had taken its time, but it had arrived. There was no celebration, no cheering. Just a quiet exhale, long and full. The document didn't change the years I had lost or the nights I cried in silence. but it gave shape to my voice. It affirmed that I had never been irrelevant. My labor, my planning, my presence, they mattered. The court didn't just return assets. It returned my sense of identity, as if saying, yes, you were here. And you made a difference. A week after the ruling, I received a knock at my door. It was one of Martin's former employees, Vanessa, his executive assistant from years ago. I hadn't seen her since a fundraising event 5 years earlier. She looked nervous, clutching a folder. I just wanted to thank you, she said quietly. Some of us knew what you were doing behind the scenes. We just never said it out loud. But we saw it. Especially during those first few years. You were the one keeping things from falling apart. She handed me the folder, copies of internal emails, budget approvals, notes I'd written that Martin had presented as his own. I didn't need them anymore, but I took them gently, touched by the gesture. You were never invisible, Vanessa added before leaving. That single sentence undid something tight inside me. For so long, I thought no one noticed. But someone had. And sometimes, even a quiet witness can be enough to validate an entire journey. A month after the final ruling, a columnist from a business and lifestyle magazine reached out. She had attended the final day of the trial and asked if I would consider sharing my story, not just the courtroom drama, but the years leading up to it. I hesitated. I wasn't interested in revenge or publicity. But then she said, there are so many women living this story. They just don't know they're allowed to name it. That line stayed with me. I agreed, on the condition that the focus wouldn't be on Martin, but on the value of unseen labor and the quiet strength it takes to endure years of erasure. The article went viral within days. Messages poured in from women around the world, thanking me for saying what they hadn't been able to. It didn't make me proud, it made me humble. Because I realized that by reclaiming my voice, I had helped others find theirs too. I didn't return to my old life, I built a new one. The business I had started in secret now had a small team. I consulted for female entrepreneurs, many of whom had left behind similar marriages or workplaces that never acknowledged their worth. My story became a quiet symbol of endurance, not for applause, but for truth. I no longer dressed for someone else's image of me. I dressed for my future, and it looked nothing like the one Martin once promised. Sometimes, I passed by places we had frequented, restaurants where I had once been introduced as just the wife, boutiques where he criticized my taste. But I never went inside. I had nothing to reclaim there. I had already taken back the one thing that mattered, myself. And for the first time in years, my name, my real name, was not something to be attached to a man. It was a story in its own right. One evening, I pulled out the leather-bound journal I had kept hidden for so many years. Its edges were worn, its pages full. I turned to the last blank sheet and picked up a pen. I didn't write a summary or a grand final statement. Just a few simple lines. You were never just a shadow. You were the structure. You were the light. I closed the journal slowly and set it on a shelf, not as a wound to revisit, but as a record of survival. Outside, the city lights shimmered through my window, no longer distant or unreachable. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and let the silence in. Not the kind that suffocates. The kind that holds you. The kind that waits patiently for the next beginning. Because this story didn't end in court. It began with a whisper, and became a voice that would never go unheard again.